The Australian Financial Review.
Our legislation has just passed the Senate.
After the biggest tax overhaul in a quarter of a century passed through Parliament last week, Treasurer Jim Chalmers claimed victory.
We see this as a win for workers, for first home buyers, for future generations.
But the win came after a bruising 6-week debate.
It is my view that every time there's tax reform, people say the sky will fall in, people say that it is disastrous, but typically what happens in time is people look back on big tax reform and wonder what all of the fuss is about.
He might be on the right track. The latest poll this week showed support for Labor bounced. But there are 2 more years until the next election, and the political landscape is changing.
If an election was held today, our party may not exist by the end of it.
Old political parties are falling apart.
It is an indication people want change.
Those that were in the background are now front and centre.
Independents Allegra Spender and Zali Steggall are forming a new centrist political party.
And new parties are forming.
Amongst all of this budget backlash, Lisa, we're also witnessing the disintegration of the two-party system, courtesy of One Nation. And just to shake it up even further, we saw the formation of a new party by the Teals.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, political editor Phillip Coorey on the government's budget backdowns, the increasingly crowded field in Australian politics, and why it will be a bumpy 2 years to the next election. It's Thursday, July 2nd. Hi, Phil. Thanks for coming back on the podcast.
A pleasure as always, Lisa.
In a busy sitting week, we appreciate it.
That's all right.
Finally, we got a deal last week on the government's budget tax changes after a very heated debate. Why was this such a big fight, and where have we landed?
Well, Lisa, to be honest, it wasn't actually a big fight. There was a lot of heat, as you say, and understandably, given the nature of the changes in the budget, especially to capital gains tax, not just on housing but across the board, and on negative gearing and so forth. But in terms of the mechanics of this, the big fight, it was one of the easiest things in the world because all the government essentially did was increase taxes, and the only people they needed to persuade to pass it were the Greens. Now, that's like pushing on an open door. There's no challenge there at all. In fact, the challenge was, if there was one, was that the Greens wanted them to go much further and wipe out capital gains tax discounts altogether and allow no one to be grandfathered from the changes. You know, I've covered some stuff in the time. I remember Howard had to get the GST through a very hostile Senate.
I was not going to allow this huge reform to go down the drain.
He had no supporters up there, Labor, Democrats, Brian Harradine.
The Democrats were trying to ping holes in the base, and I was trying to plug the holes, basically.
And that was a long negotiation with a lot of carve-outs required. So in terms of the big fight, this was like the big nothing. But that doesn't mean it wasn't controversial, and does it remain controversial with, you know, the bulk of the backlash coming from the business and investment sector. And you can understand, because business feels like it's collateral damage here. The government is still yet to define the problem it was trying to solve by extending the CGT changes to all asset classes. It's got this sort of argument that it would have distorted the tax system if they'd just changed it on housing, but they haven't really made the case for that. The Treasury Secretary, Jenny Wilkinson, at an estimates hearing a couple of weeks ago, had a moment of truth and candour when she said we needed the money, basically. So it was essentially a revenue measure, but it's caused all sorts of problems, all sorts of unintended consequences, which you get when you rush things and you don't understand what you're doing. But at the same time, they are under pressure from the Greens to go further on these measures.
The Greens will support those changes to the capital gains tax and negative gearing.
Essentially to get the Greens on board.
The big concession is a delay to cuts to the NDIS.
They delayed the passage of the bill to reform the National Disability Insurance Scheme by 2 months. Now, this is nuts, because the tax measures we're talking about don't start until July 1, 2027. They are not time critical. The NDIS savings start on July 1 this year. They started this week. They are time critical. The NDIS is going to collapse unless it's brought under control in terms of how much it costs. It is completely unsustainable. The only people in the world who think it isn't are the Greens.
We have an agreement that the NDIS bill
will not pass this fortnight.
But in return for them passing the government's bill, they demanded another 8 weeks of inquiry into the NDIS.
And will be referred for further inquiry until the middle of August, at least.
The net effect of that is the NDIS reforms will still go ahead as planned, but the budget will be in the hole by, quote, hundreds of millions of dollars. So to get the non-time critical bill through the Senate, they threw the time critical bill, kicked that into the long grass for a couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only assume that's because the government, has been getting a fair bit of blowback politically on the budget, and they want it through the parliament, so people stop talking about it, and it's no more sophisticated than that.
So let's look in detail at the changes the government has made since Budget Day. How significant are they, and how did they change the outcome?
So what happened after the government announced the changes to capital gains tax? All these donkeys started advertising on social media about, just set up an SMSF and buy a house that way, because super funds were exempt from the CGT changes. So any super fund, whether it's a retail fund, an industry fund or an SMSF, still only pays effectively a 10% capital gain tax on its gains.
Mm-hmm.
But the Greens said, there's this big loophole.
Which allows investors to use self-managed super funds to borrow money to buy investment properties.
Buying properties that way. So the government said you can no longer access these, they're called LRBA loans, to buy a property through your super fund.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really the only real concession to the Greens they had to make, other than delaying the NDIS bill.
Mm-hmm.
The other big change they made weren't to placate the Greens, they were to sort of try and calm the anger down amongst voters.
Small business owners continue to lash Labor.
Young entrepreneurs have written to the Prime Minister urging him to walk back controversial capital gains tax changes.
The larger one was for small businesses.
It's part carve out and part cave in.
Prime Minister and Treasurer with a big change for small business.
So if you have a turnover of under $2 million, and that's turnover, that's not profit, you're sort of pretty much exempt from paying capital gains tax. There are 4 different discounts you can access if your turnover is under $2 million, one of which is a complete exemption from CGT if you've owned that business longer than 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what they did, they said, OK, if your turnover is between $2 million and $10 million,
mm-hmm.
you're eligible for an additional 50% discount. However, because of the 30% floor, you're going to have to pay minimum 30% on that net gain. But it does sort of mean, on balance, that most of those businesses between 2 and 10 million would probably get a better deal, but not in all cases.
Mm.
The other big one they made was trusts. They put a 30% minimum tax on income from all discretionary trusts.
Mm-hmm.
Again, they didn't know what they were doing, because there's a thing called testamentary trusts, which can be used to minimise tax, but they're mostly used to protect inheritances. So a couple setting up their will, the kids might be little. In the event you're both killed in a car crash and the kids are in no shape to, handle all the assets, they get put into a discretionary trust, and the trustee sort of gives them an income and pays their school fees and things like that.
Mm.
So they've suddenly realised that was a mistake, so they said they won't do that.
Mm.
And then last week, of course, we saw the widow's tax, which they backed down on that. And again, they only did that because they were caught out by David Pocock and the Australian Financial Review. And so that would be in the case of, if you have a house, you negatively gear it, you bought it with your partner, it's a family sort of investment, and that house was bought before budget night. So supposedly you can keep negatively gearing that house. It's exempt from the new laws. However, if one of you dies or there's a divorce, so the surviving or the remaining member of that couple takes full ownership of that property, that's classified as a change of ownership, and all those grandfathering provisions cease to exist. So you would no longer be able to negatively gear that house, and you wouldn't get the capital gains tax grandfathering provisions either. And again, the government was quite happy to wave that through the Senate on Thursday, and it was only because Pocock picked it up in the Senate inquiry, told us, we put it on the front page.
Mm.
There's going to be a second tranche of legislation coming, Lisa, where they're going to deal with other unintended consequences, like how to treat start-up businesses under this new capital gains tax regime, because they have a zero or low capital base. So they have to come up with special rules for those. So I've called it the clean up on aisle 9 bill. This is where they're going to have to sort of deal with all the unintended consequences.
So, Phil, this felt like a bruising debate for Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Treasurer Jim Chalmers. There was lots of backlash from business. There was talk of a widow tax and death tax. It sounded bad. But the polls out this week suggest it hasn't been the hit that some might have expected. And meanwhile, support for One Nation has dipped following Pauline Hanson's controversial remarks about paid parental leave and multiculturalism. So what are the latest polls telling us?
I don't think they're good for anyone, Lisa. That's what they're telling us. So When the budget first came out, the reaction was pretty bad on two fronts. A, because it just constituted so many broken promises. And then there was also the case for sort of changing the investment tax treatment of housing has been largely established, and it wasn't so much about that as what they did to business and shares. And what the government was hoping for was essentially a class war between the younger voters and the so-called boomers. They were hoping to sort of, use that inbuilt resentment in Australian society to sort of, carry the day on this. But a lot of the young people, it didn't light their fire either, because I think they underestimated how many of them buy shares because they use that as a means to sort of accrue some wealth because property's out of reach. And a lot of them were resentful that they couldn't negatively gear or use property as investment like their forebears did. So it didn't sort of work out the way they planned. No one really liked it. Initial polls weren't good. I mean, Labor took a bath. They lost 3 or 4% off their primary vote. But more significantly, I think, is the Prime Minister and the Treasurer just got whacked. Albanese's approval rating is disastrous in the AFR Redbridge poll. It's down at -18. When I say a favourability rating, that's the combination of your favourability rating and your unfavourability rating. It's the sum, right? So if 10 people like you and 20 people hate you, you've got a -10, right? So he was 0 in December. Then Bondi happened. He plunged to -18 after Bondi. Then they did a very good job on petrol after the Iran war, and he clawed that back to about -9. And then the next poll after the budget, it dropped to -18, and it has stayed there in the latest poll.
Okay.
But, the one that matters on election day is your vote, right?
And they got a little bump.
Yeah, they've had a little bump. So in our latest poll, they went from 28% back to 30%, whereas Hanson went from 31 to 29. So taking into account the margin of error, they're statistically tied now with One Nation, but on a two-party preferred basis, they would still win pretty comfortably if an election was held today, just the way preferences flow now, and the Greens are sitting on 14.
Yeah.
So they're feeling a bit, this week, they're feeling a bit more relieved, and I suspect a fair bit of that is because of all the backdowns they announced. Plus also, I think too, it's starting to show in the housing market. Yeah, we're seeing auction rates collapsing, house prices collapsing. Now, that's not a popular thing amongst a lot of people because people don't like watching their asset value fall, especially people who've taken out big loans and suddenly are falling into negative equity. So the government would never publicly say that's a good thing, but privately they're quite happy it's happening because there's also half the population out there who thinks it's good. I might be able to buy a house. So I suspect there's a sort of adjustment going on now amongst the electorate. Hanson, bit different, Lisa. So One Nation is still up there in terms of the primary vote.
The surging support for One Nation has hit a speed bump, dropping slightly in the latest polling.
The big move in our latest poll was her personal rating. She had a net favourability of 0, so she was vastly more popular than Angus Taylor or Anthony Albanese, but she went backwards by 10 points in a month.
Yeah, that's a big drop.
Yeah, that's a big fall. That's the same fall Albanese suffered on the back of the budget in his own rating. So she's been marked down pretty sharply.
Pauline Hanson has delivered a fiery maiden speech at the National Press Club.
And we can only assume that's from her performance at the Press Club the other week.
We cannot be a multicultural society.
She said some things on paid parental leave and monoculture.
We must be monocultural. It's time we woke up.
There'll be a lot of people watching for the first time who are flirting with One Nation and think, actually, I didn't like that. And so that's the logical explanation for that. And then, of course, the worst of all is like Angus Taylor and the Liberal Party. I mean, you'd much rather be Pauline Hanson or Anthony Albanese than Angus Taylor and the Coalition. He's on a flogging, that bloke. Their primary vote is back at 18, which is where it was when they knocked off Susan Lee. His preferred Prime Minister, he's only 11% as preferred Prime Minister. Albanese's 33, Hanson's 26. And the one thing that was holding up for Taylor was his favourability rating. He was quite popular, around -2. That's just dropped to -9. So they had a shocking couple of weeks and, they were running around this week like chooks with their head cut off, not knowing what to do. Amongst all of this budget backlash, Lisa, we're also witnessing the disintegration of the two-party system, courtesy of One Nation, the ascendancy of One Nation, and just to shake it up even further, we saw the formation of a new party by the Teals. Politics now has certainly become a crowded field, and it's making it even harder to try and work out how the next election's going to unfold.
We're talking about the government budget tax changes which finally went through Parliament last week and the political upheaval at the moment which is making it hard to work out what will happen at the next election. Phil, last week, as you said, we saw the formation of a new political party, Community Strong Australia, by two of the most prominent Teals, Allegra Spender and Zali Steggall. What does that mean for Labor and the coalition and the next election?
Who knows? Probably not much. I think what it means up front was some of the people in the Teal movement have suddenly realised that you can spend $1 gazillion to win seats in the lower house and it hasn't really done much because they've now been around for 4 or 5 years, the Teals. Or Zali Steggall, she was a sort of mother Teal. She came in 2019 before the Teals were Teals. But their number, they've been numerically irrelevant in the lower house all that time. They haven't been able to have any influence whatsoever on policy. Whereas if you lack the wherewithal to form government or part of a coalition, then your best bet's the Senate. And the greatest example of that is the Greens, right? They got reduced to 1 MP in the lower house at the last election, but they've still got 10 senators. And as we discussed earlier, they've had the whip hand in this budget. A lot of the sort of casualties of this budget are the sorts of people in those Teal electorates, the people on higher incomes who might have a bit of asset wealth and their MPs haven't been able to do anything to sort of, soften the blow. So it's not a simple thing, Lisa, because if you want to run in the Senate, you got to get your name above the line on the ballot paper because about 98% of people vote above the line. Very few people fill out all those boxes underneath, 1 to 100 or whatever. But you can only get your name above the line if you are a party, a political party. So they're not the first to do this. I mean, everyone comes into the Senate, all these independents, and then after a while they realise I'm not going to get re-elected unless I form myself a party. And we've had all sorts over the years, like the Glenn Lazarus experience and the Jackie Lambie network and the Nick Xenophon team and even David Pocock, who's a lone wolf here in the ACT, calls himself the David Pocock Party so he can get above the line on the ballot paper here. And so what has happened is Zali Steggall and Allegra Spender, I think, have sort of worked this out that if they want to have some influence, they got to get themselves above the line. What's interesting is no one else wanted anything to do with it, or the other Teals. I mean, it's 2 out of about 9 of them, like Monique Ryan, Kate Cheney and the other independents. Nicola Bullis sort of saw this as a bit of a betrayal of the electorates. They were elected as community independents. They weren't elected as a political party. So, they're not hostile. Or I think Monique is. She wouldn't do it in a pink fit. But the others are sort of happy to see how it rolls and then maybe join up after the next election. But it's going to be difficult because to get a Senate spot, you've got to get about 14% of the vote in your state. Now, the worst state to try and do that is New South Wales because it's the most populous state. And unless you run in every single electorate just to get your vote up statewide, if every voter in Wentworth, which is Allegra's seat, and Warringah, which is Zali's seat, voted for this mob in the Senate, they still wouldn't get up. No harm in trying, and it's a sort of a fledgling movement, and it's certainly not the first attempt at doing this.
And their pitch is to what they call the homeless voters.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's always been that middle where most people sort of reside. So you're talking about people who are economically conservative, so they understand that, a country needs to live within its means, that you shouldn't spend more money than you have and have huge debts and deficits, and you should encourage business and other things that actually create wealth and drive productivity, because without that, no one's got a job. At the same time, you can have that view, but you can also believe in the environment and the climate change and socially progressive issues. Now, that mantle used to be sort of held variously by the moderate wing of the Liberal Party and the right wing of the Labor Party. Now, there's no economic conservatives left in the Labor Party. We've got the highest spending government since Gough Whitlam, with a treasurer who belongs to the right of the Labor Party, and that's the highest spending government outside of crises such as COVID. And on the other side, the moderate Liberals have basically ceased to exist. You try and hold a socially progressive or pro-environmental view in the Liberal Party and you're a pariah. And that's sort of where Steggall and Spender are aligned, and they've identified that as their pitch. It's not the first time. If you go back to the early 70s in South Australia, there was a split between the Conservative and moderate Liberals. It was the only time the Liberal Party split, which sort of gave rise to the Australian Democrats, which try to hold that space for about 30 years, and now we're seeing it with the Teals. But I think unless they actually put some ginger in their pop, they're not going to go anywhere, because the field is now so crowded. There are so many parties and candidates. It's not like you're just coming up the middle of the Labor and the Liberal Party. You've got Greens and One Nation and all these sort of micro parties in the Senate and stuff to compete with. So it's going to need money, it's going to need leadership, it's going to need structure, and at this stage it doesn't really have any of that.
But One Nation does, and if the budget debate and the formation of this party show that the power lies in the Senate, how will One Nation go, do you think? Is that where they're targeting?
If the election were to be held now, I think One Nation would win as many as 14 Senate spots.
Wow, okay.
Now, they've got 4 at the moment. I saw an analysis the other day by Ben Oquist, anyone around Canberra knows who Ben is, but He's been around a long time, used to work for Bob Brown. He's very good on doing Senate predictions. They've got 4 now. At the next election, only one of those, Pauline Hanson, is up for re-election. The rest are mid-term. Pauline will win her spot easily, and probably another one in Queensland. So that's 5. And then I reckon they'll pick up at least one again in all the other states. Based on current levels of support, let's remember anything can happen in the next couple of years. So they could end up, anything between 10 and 14 senators. The Greens would probably still wind up with their 9 or 10. So you'd have 2 distinct balance of power blocks in the Senate. Now, depending who's in government in the lower house and how that's all going to work, One Nation could still win a few seats in the lower house. I still suspect they'll get some. I don't think they're going to come anywhere close to forming government, but you might find that their greatest sway might be in the upper house.
Yeah. And Phil, you touched on the poor showing of Angus Taylor and the coalition in the polls. In a week where the opposition really should have been focusing attention on the last-minute changes to the government's tax reforms, Angus Taylor got caught up in a debate over multiculturalism. There's been some speculation of unrest over his leadership. Would we really have another leader, do you think?
I think it's likely, highly likely, between now and the next election, the Liberal Party will have another leader. There's no doubt about it in terms of the conversations that are being had inside the Liberal Party. Clearly, they will not go to the next election with things the way they are, Lisa. It's sort of to the point where despair is at such a level that there's an acceptance that even if you put the good Lord into the chair now, you wouldn't be able to turn it around. The structural problem, whatever's caused this, is far greater than one person's going to be able to sort of engineer. Labor's not their problem, One Nation is their problem, right? If you look at the polls this week, about 45 to 48% of voters are still voting Conservative. It's only 18% of them, 17 are voting for the coalition, the rest are voting for One Nation. So they've got to get them back. And that involves a couple of strategies. A, it's convincing One Nation that your target is not the coalition, it's Labor. and also convincing those One Nation voters that Pauline really can't do for you what you want done.
Yeah.
So Angus Taylor's view is that if they are to survive, they have to do it on the economy. That's always been their strength, economic management, the budget, the economy. But even so, we had this week where the government's budget had all sorts of problems. They were backflipping on the widow's tax, backflipping on the small business thing, doing deals with the Greens. It was a slow-moving target. And instead, he just got himself in the weeds with Pauline Hanson over this mindless and impenetrable sort of argument over monoculture versus multiculturalism, and just didn't have a form of words. And, people were going, really, in the Liberal Party, really, it's just not been good at politics. So another couple of weeks like that, they might bone him.
Okay. So, Phil, the next fight for the government is over the National Disability Insurance Scheme. There's $38 billion in savings at stake. How do you think that will play out? Will there need to be concessions there to get the coalition over the line?
Look, at this stage, no. From what I'm hearing, Lisa, the deal is done. Because you've got to remember, if the coalition does win the next election or the one after, they got to fix this thing if Labor doesn't do it for them.
Yeah.
To their credit, when Scott Morrison was in government, he was the one who first rang the alarm on the NDIS and said, this thing's out of control. If we don't restructure it, and we don't refocus it on the people it was designed for, the significantly and permanently disabled, then it will be unsustainable. Everything he said and more has come to pass. When Morrison was making these noises, Labor was accusing him of a fear campaign, of being cruel to disabled people, and refused to help. Then they got into government and realised he wasn't bluffing, and the problem is 10 times worse now than it was just back then. So there's this universal recognition in the major party, and One Nation too, to be honest. To actually be fair, Hanson called this out before Morrison, where she was seeing some of the fraud that was going on and so forth. So there's this universal recognition across the parliament, apart from the Greens, that this scheme has to be reined in, otherwise it will just be wound up one day because it will be unaffordable. No one wants that to happen because it's set up for the most noble of purposes. That doesn't excuse or discount the fact that the coalition, because they're in such a desperate state, might start playing a bit of politics over the next 8 weeks. There is going to be some hardship with these changes. There's always people on the line, where you draw the line when people get booted off the scheme onto other schemes and no longer have access to the Rolls-Royce schemes that the NDIS provides. And, social media is so powerful now in allowing people to narrowcast grievance. So there will be a temptation by the coalition to demand some sort of concessions from the government to claim a win, and given they're sort of fairly desperate and they owe the government nothing, let's wait and see. But I think more or less it should be through by August.
So a final question, Phil. The Labor conference will be held later this month, marking the halfway point in the Albanese government's second term. Will they be able to move past the budget backlash? And what's next?
Oh, 100%. A large part of the reason they wanted the budget through, as we said earlier, it wasn't time critical. They could have taken another 6 months to get it right and iron out all the bugs and not have to put up with all the embarrassment. But one of the reasons they want it rammed through, apart from getting it out of the public conversation, is because the Labor National Conference, as it's known, it's once every 3 years. It's the big showcase event. It's where you sort of bare your soul to the nation. This year it's in Adelaide, and the Prime Minister kicks it off with a big red meat speech to the party faithful and the rank and file, and everyone's there, the unions and all the branch members and everyone else. And what better to have under your arm than this sort of Labor budget where they've stuck it to the asset classes, on behalf of the workers. So I suspect that it'll be the budget, far from being a backlash, will be hailed as some sort of triumph. Come National Conference, I suspect it will play a significant part in Albanese's speech, at which he will, portray himself as the battler guy. One of the reasons that, and this goes to your second part of the question, how's the run-up to the election, they were sort of hoping inflation to be under control by now, and it's not. Inflation was already out of control before the war in Iran, and it's not getting much better now, as we saw from the numbers last week. So Labor is now resigned to the fact that high inflation is going to run all the way to the election. That means two things. One, nation will stay popular because cost of living is what is fueling that grievance. And it also means more interest rate increases, stuff like that. Now, sadly, rather than try and get inflation under control, I suspect, and I think early signs already point to this, the government sees its way through that is to just spend more money. I don't think we're going to see the words fiscal rectitude appear in the next 18 months.
Thanks, Phil.
No worries.
Thanks for listening to The Fin. On the podcast today, political editor Phillip Coorey. If you want to read more about the debate over the tax changes and this week's poll, check out the show notes. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coulin, and Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. A very special thank you to head of audio Alex Gow, who has been with The Fin right from the beginning. A talented musician, Alex composed our theme and helped to shape the podcast. This will be his last week with the AFR. We wish him all the best. He will be missed. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. I'm Lisa Murray. Fiona Buffini will be in the chair next week.
The Australian Financial Review.